Good evening. My name is Johanna Koljonen and you are watching Crosstalks, a collaboration between two of Sweden's leading universities, Stockholm University and KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology. Do join us in discussing today's topics on Twitter, where our handle is Crosstalks TV and our hashtag is Crosstalks. The submarine, the helicopter, and atomic power are all inventions in some way inspired by the fictional works of authors like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. Fiction can also be a way to explore future consequences and possibilities of scientific findings. But how important is this exchange of ideas for science? How does the way science is portrayed in popular culture affect the public perception of scientific research? And what could be some of the next big scientific leaps that we are imagining in popular culture today? Here to discuss these exciting topics are Sara Ilstedt, Professor of Product and Service Design, KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Joakim Wrethed, Lecturer, Department of English, Stockholm University, and Sabine Höhler, Associate Professor of Science and Technology Studies at KTH Royal Institute of Technology, which is here in Stockholm. Welcome to Crosstalks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sara, you've studied the process of design and innovation for a long time. How important is the influence of fiction and popular culture in these fields?
Well, I don't think it could be overestimated. It's actually huge, both a long time ago, like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells that you mentioned, but also more recently in science fiction and, for example, William Gibson. And there is a need for a vision that can inspire scientists and researchers, and also for ideas that could be shared by many people so they walk in the same direction. And I think that one of the that I remember myself was when Gibson wrote the book Neuromancer, and he launched the word cyberspace to describe this very vague but sort of intriguing digital world where everything floated, and how this was so inspiring, and thousands of computer scientists all over the world actually went about to realize this. So yeah,
that is very exciting, and it's also you're pointing at something interesting here, which is, of course, Gibson is a specialist. Many writers, I would assume he's sort of a generalist. He knows a fair amount of many kinds of science, and he gave us this vision of what essentially our life today would be like. Joakim Wrethed, you wrote your doctoral thesis about the Irish author John Banville and his trilogy of books based on the lives of some of history's most famous scientists, Nicolaus Copernicus, Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton. Can you explain why you find these works so interesting?
Yes, I think there are mainly two things that I'd like to bring to this discussion. I think that the first thing would be what Banville himself was interested in, and we can take Copernicus as the first example. And I think it is the affinities between the creative artist on the one hand and the scientist on the other. If we take Copernicus as the example, in the novel he gets his idea sort of out of the air, or from the gods if you wish. But then he tries to make his science fit the idea. And that turns out to be a very difficult process, and it's even impossible because he's still counting on circular planetary motions, and they are not circular. So that's why he gets lost on the way, and he can't really get his science to fit the idea. And I think that Banville saw affinities between this process and the creative process of the artist. You know, you can get an idea for a novel project, but then you have to write the novel as well. And I think the creative imagination is the common denominator there, I think.
What do you think we can learn by studying how science and scientists are portrayed in fiction? Can they tell us something about science, for instance?
Yes, I think so. We can see throughout literary history how science pushes fiction and fiction pushes science. So there's a reciprocal kind of process going on. And I think what we also can see is for every utopian narrative that you get about, dozens of dystopian narratives. So it seems as if we as human beings, we are almost obsessed with trying out the worst case scenario for any kind of innovation. And why that is, I'm not sure. Maybe that's a question we could discuss.
I do have to follow up with this. Is it correct that Johannes Kepler actually wrote a novel published after his death?
Yes.
Possibly the first science fiction novel. What was this about?
Yes, it's arguably the first science fiction narrative that's been written. It's called Somnium. And it's very interesting for one reason especially, that in his science, he wrote a book called Astronomy Novum. And in his science, he was onto the idea of gravity, but he couldn't quite pinpoint it in his science. But then when he wrote his imaginative fiction, which is called Somnium, which is about a trip to the moon, and he sees astronomy from the perspective of the moon, then he took gravity for granted. So something he couldn't really pinpoint within his science, he could write about in his fiction. So this means that Kepler the scientist inspired Kepler the writer. So that's quite interesting, I think.
That's exciting. So Sabine, you've said that you believe that there is a need for the academic world to open up even more to ideas from other sectors. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think it's already happening. Science is leaving the ivory tower, and of course those are good examples from the past, but I'm a historian of science, and I've tried to look at these longer trajectories, and what we see, I think, right now is a leaving of the traditional disciplines, these little kingdoms of academic expertise that have worked for a long time, recruiting, educating students in a very strict way, making them specialists in particular fields. And these compounds, I think they worked until the mid-20th century maximum, but they don't any longer. So then we had the hyphenations, biotechnology, geoecology, business, engineering, and it seems that doesn't work any longer either. So now we're facing problems that are of a scale, or global in scale. Think of global environmental change, climate change issues, urban growth, human habitation, migration, of a kind that they cannot be addressed any longer by these disciplinary fields. So I think that new solutions and also new collaborations are asked for, and that is increasingly happening at the moment. Otherwise, we perhaps wouldn't sit here in a Crosstalks TV screening of this kind. We discuss across the boundaries of what we somehow were secure of and knowledgeable of. And that's very interesting. The last thing you say there, that we have to approach, to have these conversations, we have to approach in some way the limits of our knowledge, or we have to step outside our field of expertise to take in the opinions of others. But perhaps we are still most safe doing it across scientific disciplines. What is the role of art, do you think, in this context? Well, you've inserted wonderful examples here of Kepler and also the neuromancer of inspiration, but I wouldn't want to see this as a sort of a top-down process of, here's science presenting results and problem solutions, and then also take in some inspiration from other sectors or other fields, but rather inspire or invite bottom-up processes of collaboration that need to be done in another way. And I think we're just now trying to find how these ways could work. I mean, outside of KTH, outside of this main building, we see this dome of vision. It was just recently erected to create space for sustainable ideas. And I do hope that this will be indeed a bottom-up process of inviting people from all over the place, different institutions, art perhaps, politics, economics, to think together, to discuss what is needed, whether it's city planning or the future of sustainable mobility or something.
So if we do look back a little bit still at the historical context, science has traditionally perceived itself as self-sufficient in some way, a fountain of truth, not necessarily as much as searchers for the truth, but actually the ones that deliver knowledge. Why do you think that is? And is it? We're saying it needs to change, but do you find this actually changing in your institutions?
Well, yes, it's changing, and it needs to change, but there's still a lag, I think, in how the academic world and the financing and the structure is working. So if you're working very cross-disciplinary and in huge teams, it's very difficult. It's difficult to get funding, it's difficult with publication, it's difficult. I mean, there's lots of things that doesn't really work so well with the academic system. So there's we need to develop the structures for that better.
Yes, I think, but this kind of very sharp specialist knowledge is also needed. So I think the academy is probably adjusting, but as always with the academy, it happens quite slowly.
In this tradition of the ideal of science, this is still reflected also in, I think, how we portray scientists in fiction. Often a brilliant lone wolf, typically still a male, who does brilliant work alone. Was this ever true? How true is this now?
It's not true. I think most of what we do in our department is teamwork nowadays. But rewarded or awarded is the one person. Think of the Nobel Prize that is given always to, well, maybe one or maybe two people, or three max, for one big discovery. The teamwork is usually invisibilized then at some point, and when one particular scientist sticks out for his or her publication. So I think that the perception, also the self-perception of science is still following this, the lone genius image, and you can also see that in fiction, where scientists are presented.
So why does this image persist?
Yeah, but I think it actually has a real background, because it says about Kepler that the first time around he had gave a course at the university. He had 6 students there, but his mind trailed off all the time, and the next term he had 0 students. So he gave his lectures to himself. So I think the image has some kind of real background, I suppose. Yes.
So, yeah, and it has changed. It's very much a collaborative process today, but it's amazing how the image in film and in media is still so focused on this lonely male, heroic or maybe crazy scientists that
the mad scientist is sort of the other
it's
extreme
like a favorite persona in film.
I realize I do have to check. Do any of you know any mad scientists?
Only from film.
Joakim looks a little bit Frankenstein.
Yeah, I was actually thinking seriously, but I think they're mostly from fiction, and I think that fiction has actually created this mad scientist to some great extent. Also, I'm thinking about Victor Frankenstein, for
I
instance,
was thinking of Frankenstein.
who is sort of monomaniac. He's just want to create life. That's his sole project in life, and he neglects everything else.
And neglects his private life as well, and the cost can be limitless.
Yes,
that's right.
yes.
So what about counterexamples? Do you think fiction and popular culture then can help change this image? That would probably serve academia well, and certainly it would serve female researchers well.
Yeah, I do think it could happen, but it's not happening enough yet. So just thinking of new examples or recent examples of, I was thinking of The Day After Tomorrow, grand, global climate change topic, and we still see a lone warrior, this male, white US head of the family, who is the lone warner of this reversal of the Gulf Stream, and then he sort of becomes some sort of national hero, of course. So that is very conventional in a way, and Hollywood blockbusters work in this way. But you could also think of some like also more recent examples of Contact, for instance, this movie from 1997, or Prometheus, the 2013, where we had female scientists in the lead. And I think we will see more of that, also more teamwork. I'm sure we'll see more teams in the future of these sort of science fiction blockbusters.
Sara?
Yeah, I was just saying that even in recent Swedish television series, like Äkta människor, real people, then there were these scientists that were so upset about his wife drowning, so he made her into a robot that could have feelings, and then this put the sort of chain into action. So he was lonely and he was kind of mad in a way.
Yes, that's very interesting, because of course that might that could just as well be a female scientist who is grieving for a husband, but that seems like a very unrealistic storyline. At least it would be very unlikely for us that we'd get to see that. Sara, you worked on a project called Life 2053, which you describe as trying to create a vision of the future that is somewhat positive. Can you
That is
elucidate
positive,
this?
I would say.
That is positive, so not dystopian, I guess, then.
Yeah.
But is it actually utopian? Is it very positive outcomes that you're looking for?
Well, I don't think we try to make a vision of the future that would seem natural and kind of based on people's everyday life, because we wanted to have something that a vision that works, a counter vision towards all these dystopian and catastrophic future images that we're surrounded of by in media, in film, and in literature everywhere. And we know that these kind of visions about the future actually form how the future becomes, because we can't imagine something that is not there. We use the images that are around to imagine the future and what to do with the future. So we need images of the future that about a sustainable future that is positive and where people are happy and where there's a well-being, even if we on the same time can't consume as much or use as much energy and maybe don't fly to everywhere in the world all the time. So we wanted to do this vision or present it, but not like from a top down, but rather from an everyday perspective. So what you do here is that you sort of try a day in a lifetime in 2053. Where
How?
you can choose. Well, you can go in there and it's on the web.
You've built it physically?
No, it's images and texts, and so. But you go in there and you choose your lifestyle. You choose where you live and how much money you earn and how much time you have. So it's also a way of showing that you can actually have different lifestyles, even in a sustainable future. And it doesn't have to be only built on sacrifices, like it's cold, it's boring, you can't eat anything, and you go back to middle age.
When envisioning the future, where did you draw the inspiration? Who decided on what the future would be in this project?
Oh, that was really a collaborative work with the researchers and game developers and designers and all kind of people. And we looked a lot of gaming, science fiction and films, but we also were very much inspired by, for example, the Stockholm exhibition 1930, where they were trying to solve the problem of housing shortage, because they were that was the big issue then in the 1920s. So what they did was to show that we can build good, small but functional and hygienic flats with bathtubs and kitchens for everybody, and this could be a future that we could have. And because it was real and it was there and it was like exhibition, you could walk into it, it had enormous impact on Sweden's development.
It's
And
funny,
also-
it really did become the standard
Yes.
of life here. Now, of course, it's very difficult to think that this functionalism was once futuristic. Let's bring in another guest. Joining us now via Skype is Chad Orzel, physics professor at Union College, New York, and author of the books How to Teach Physics to Your Dog, How to Teach Quantum Physics to Your Dog, and How to Teach Relativity to Your Dog. Welcome to Crosstalks, Chad.
Thank you very much.
You must have one very well-educated dog.
Yeah, she's pretty sharp. She's a German Shepherd mix, and very inquisitive as dogs tend to be. And this worked out pretty well as a hook for some books.
Your work as an author has been about communicating science to non-scientists, including human non-scientists, using imagery and stories taken from everyday life. So how does this, and the dog, how does this everyday idea help you explain physics to your readers?
Well, one of the biggest obstacles to people understanding relativity and quantum mechanics is that they seem really weird. Right, they run counter to your everyday experience, and that's largely due to human preconceptions about how things should work. But if you look at the world the way a dog does, right, a dog sees the world as a source of amazement and wonder. If you come at physics from that angle, it's a lot more appropriate.
Maybe you have an example of this.
Well, for example, in quantum physics, in quantum electrodynamics, there are these virtual particles that pop into existence from the vacuum. And, if a bag of dog treats popped into existence in the middle of my kitchen, I would be kind of freaked out by that. But, my dog has been waiting for that to happen for 10 years. And she would just feel vindicated. And so from the dog perspective, that's less weird, and it provides a way in for people who aren't already scientists.
You've said that you liked reading science fiction that you were younger and that you still do. What do you think makes these stories resonate with you?
What I really like to see in the genre is sort of the working out of some idea, right? So people latch onto some scientific concept and will say, okay, let's take this to its extreme and see how does that apply to interesting situation. And I think that's something that goes on in science and also in science fiction, that some of the most indelible images from physics are these thought experiments that people like Einstein or infamously Erwin Schrödinger, the cat box, right? They imagine these scenarios and then talk about, okay, this is what would happen in that scenario, and that's really attractive.
There is this idea. I mean, of course, some concepts in come to think of it in physics, like the Big Bang or dark matter, that are quite poetic. I've never thought of it this way, but actually there is an overlap in some way between literature and science. You're all nodding. Would anyone like to come in on this? Sabine, is there an overlap?
Well, I like this observation that it's poetic, which I really, I appreciate that. But it's also, science and fiction can also create a very closed universe around these big questions that make it really hard to access when you're the lay person or the dog or any lay person in the field, and that I find is hard to crack open. This kind of connection that is around the very spectacular big questions, and I also really appreciate here Chad's approach of breaking this down to something that is bricolage, that is doing the bits and pieces and learning, and in this way creating access for everyone, and not making it a very exclusive project.
Joakim.
But I feel sympathetic towards the analogy between dark matter within physics and dark matter within literature, because it's something that we try to get at, but we don't quite get there. It's something that we can only see or measure in terms of science the effects of, but we can't really see what it is. And I think there is even a book called The Dark Matter of Words. So this, really complex texts have this kind of quality, I think.
If we're on a sort of practical level, is there anything, Chad, for instance, that you learned from science fiction that you can use in your scientific work?
Well, like I said, a lot of the quantum pioneers, people like Einstein, Niels Bohr, like that, they did a lot of the same sort of extrapolation of ideas, of saying, okay, here's a weird thing that happens on the microscopic scale. what if we could make that macroscopic? Then what would we see? And there's a lot of things that are very strange when you get to these extreme situations of very, very small things where quantum mechanics applies, or very, very big things where general relativity applies, or very small, very big things where both of them apply. Where you can't think about it as something concrete that you deal with. You have to work in analogies and sort of metaphors and analogy that are very literary.
That's right. What about you guys? Have you learned anything from science fiction that you use?
Not immediately, but I agree that to break it down on a level that a human being can understand these big, very big or very small questions, that is when we can sympathize or empathize. This is what I learn. Like, it's the function of the narrative or the story, that we need something to understand, to feel. So it's difficult to feel a formula or to empathize with the idea that E equals mc squared or something. We can idolize it, but it's hard to understand on this empathic level, I find.
So communication is clearly one thing that the science community can learn from popular culture, just the meaning of narratives and metaphors. Are there others, Sara?
Well, maybe something different. I was thinking about some 20 years ago. There were a lot of discussion in science fiction about the symbiosis between machines and a human being, and also the idea of the cyborg. And I was very fascinated by that. And in the research team that I was in, when I was a PhD student at the Interactive Institute, we developed a product based on this idea, where we're trying to interact with machine in another way. So we designed a game called Brain Ball that measured the brain activity. And the idea was that you competed not in activity but in relaxation. So and not in being active or not with your mind, but rather with your body and and trying to control your body by being relaxed. So that was another way of actually making this idea tangible and materialize it. Which is something you can do in design or art.
This idea of the cyborg, you're right, was very dominant. And of course, I mean, people who are old enough will remember when the Terminator series started and all these ideas of the sort of, I mean, the human-machine meld somehow. Now we are, in some sense, a metaphorical sense, is all cyborgs. And some people, of course, including people with cochlear implants, for instance, are, in a practical way, cyborgs. But we don't tend to call that anymore. Have we stopped being afraid of the human-machine meld?
In one sense, we have made it our own. We have empowered it and made it. We're not afraid of it because it's not alien in the same sense. But there are other issues that we are confronting, like the real people, the robots, for example, that are very similar to human beings. What will happen then? Or the X-Men thing, where your genetically is changing, and what is happening to human beings then. So there are other issues. Maybe you can have other ideas on that.
No, it's back to that. Chad.
Yeah.
No?
Chad.
I just want to say, I think there's a sense in which a lot of these things are kind of a moving target. And I have a colleague in computer science who made a comment a while ago about artificial intelligence. And it said, if you go back 40 years, people would say that the hallmark of artificial intelligence would be being able to make a computer that could play chess, that could beat a human at chess. And it said, these days, right, you don't teach that in a course on artificial intelligence. You teach that in a course on algorithm design, because it turns out to be a problem that's really easy. And we have computers no human can beat the game of chess. But, we no longer think of that as artificial intelligence. We've just pushed that farther down the road.
That's right.
So something like a cochlear implant isn't thought of as a cyborg because it's ordinary, right? And cyborg is still a little further down the road.
Yeah, and I think it's the thing that I mentioned earlier, that dystopian narratives is somehow a process for us probably to get used to new ideas. So we think out the worst case scenario to sort of get over some kind of threshold. I think that's one way of seeing it anyway.
But it is interesting that dystopian narratives are so dominant. I mean, I realize that probably has narrative reasons as well. It's more easy to tell stories
Dramatic.
about fear than about friendship, I guess. But I mean, we do tell some great stories about friendship as well. So I don't see why utopias are so underrepresented. What could some of the reasons for this be?
I don't know, but I know there is one interesting example from literary history, and it is one utopian written by Francis Bacon. It was published in 1627, and it's called The New Atlantis. And that's typically the narrator reaches an alien civilization, and their society works so well, and science is really central in the society. So science works very well in that society. And then later, Jonathan Swift, of course, satirizes this in Gulliver's Travels. I think it is in part 3. He reaches the island of the flying island of Laputa, and there you have all the male population are mad scientists. They walk around. They can't even function socially at all, any of them. So it's totally full of mad scientists. So he satirizes the Baconian idea. But then the funny thing is that Swift uses all of the idea of the flying island of Laputa on current science, on experiments on magnetism. So in satirizing the idea, he's using science. So it shows the interrelatedness of the two fields in a way.
But Sabine, sorry, yes, Chad.
I was going to say, I think that the biggest issue with dystopia versus utopia is it's hard to have a story without conflict. Right. And if you have a really utopian situation, you have less conflict. There are interesting examples of people who have written arguably utopian futures. The Scottish author Ian Banks is a really good example. He has a lot of stories set in the culture, which is an extremely advanced civilization that's arguably a utopia. But to make stories about it, he tells those stories on the fringes of the culture, where it's encountering other less advanced civilizations. And that's where the conflict comes from.
And obviously Star Trek would be an example of a sort of optimistic 60s science fiction idea that still lives on, but obviously the stories that we tell in that universe tend not to be so much about how all of the nations are friends with each other and production and energy are limitless. They do tend to be about war. I wonder, Sabine, you've looked a little bit about utopia, at historic ideas.
Well, I was thinking and agreeing with Chad here and also Joakim of the, utopia is the no place, right? That is what it means as defined by Sir Thomas More, 1516 in this book, Utopia. So it's an ideal place. It's so idealized. This island of order in a sea of chaos. So no wonder Bacon's Atlantis is an island as well. So humans are not made to be so perfect. They're imperfect, they're fallible. And so I think humanity is not allowed to inhabit this utopian space, really. So it must remain ideal. And instead, dystopia offers itself to much more dramatic storylines here, as you said. So you can have the post-apocalyptic survivor community, just a few people, everything in ruins. And then you can still end on a hopeful note. So they get a second chance to start from scratch. And we just love these second chances.
But it's
we
so
don't want to endless forever live in a state of order where everything works.
But the second chance is about a second chance to make a utopia, or at least a functioning society
at least
somehow.
Some sort of a functional society.
So we do need the goal. And when you come to think of it,
Trek-wise.
we did spend a big part of the 20th century in a conflict between two conflicting ideas of what utopia could be, a sort of communist ideal, and the idea of the perfect consumer society, and neither of those, it turns out, neither of the systems could deliver, but also neither of those utopias turned out to be as perfect as theoretically presumed. So that don't we need a utopia to strive towards? I worry that we seem to be lacking. We don't have a lot of stories of what it could be.
The poetry line: "A man's reach should exceed his grasp," or "What's a heaven for?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just in the coming days, there's a seminar about art and how art should relate to the issue of sustainability, because art has sort of withdrawn from that. So there's a lot of artists and writers and film people there. So it's an issue. There is a lack of good visions and of artists engaging in these visions. That's true, and it's a problem. And I would also like to comment on how environmental activists are portrayed in films and television series, because they are often, or almost all the time, seen as some kind of maniacs, sociopaths. They start out as idealists and then they turn into these terrible people who murder and their anxiety, and they end up in prison. So that's the kind of dominating view of what an environmental activist is. And of course that's also influencing our own perceptions about these people.
Joakim.
I think there's...
Yeah. We're doing this all the time.
There's also... Sorry.
Okay.
No, Chad, you go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah.
Chad, you go ahead.
I was going to say, there's also sort of a psychological bias toward regarding negative things as more serious than positive ones. That if you present an idea that this technology is going to revolutionize the world and make everybody's lives better, people are like, well, you're just a booster, Pollyanna stuff, and go give a TED talk, and then the serious thing is, here's how this technology is going to doom us all in the future. And that gets weighted as more worthwhile in a lot of senses. And so I think that influences things as well. It's seen as more serious to say that this is a threat than it is to say this is wonderful, look at this cool thing.
That is so true. But at the same time, we are also living in this, I almost said age, but I guess the last 100 years have been this age at least of this astounding techno optimism that even though we tell all of these dystopic stories and even though we are worried about the threats, in fact, the sort of cultural norm seems to be that technology is generally speaking good and is going to lead to a better place. Why is this then? How do we resolve this conflict? Joakim.
Well, I'm not sure. We talked a little bit about it, Sabine.
We did. I think we talked about the gadgets that we all so much love.
Yeah.
I was thinking of, wearable technology, and then these optical head-mounted devices, and you have all the information just on your glasses, and you can have your Bluetooth device sewn into your clothes or under your skin and become a cyborg again. So we're cyborgs with what we wear and how we sort of inhabit this world. And that is what we love and mostly find unproblematic.
Yeah.
But that is what I think is science fiction. Does science fiction not address? So science fiction addresses much larger questions, not so much on the gadget level, like that. We all know that the first tablet computer was first seen on the Enterprise somehow. So we've seen it all in Star Trek. But that is not what is at stake, I think, when it's about the politics and really these large social, cultural questions of what technology or science and technoscience will bring. That's on the level of whatever, genetically modified organisms, genetic engineering, biomedicine, cloning. So those are the monsters that we're dealing with nowadays, not your Bluetooth device or not your power cordless charger or something.
Sara?
Yeah, I also think that there's a difference between how these issues are treated within art and in technological research. Because in art, there's generally a critical view of technology and the future, etc. But within the sort of science community, there's much more of an optimistic view. And maybe that's some kind of the meaning of art, to be more critical. And I think that in the science community, there's a lot of very optimistic ideas about the future, how energy, for example, how we will be saved by technology, and we don't really have to do anything. Technology is just going to save us, like on a white horse coming riding, and kind of, if we are covering Sahara with solar panels, and you could build the third generation nuclear power plants in Siberia because it needs to be really cold areas, and then you have these enormous cables going all over the world and kind of just distributing the energy. So that would be solved, no problem. And and people, I've heard people say that completely serious. So
I'm interested. This is anecdotal, but I find I work a lot in the cultural world, and I find that artists and people with a lot of power in the cultural sphere tend to be late adopters of new technology, and for instance, sometimes, for instance, it seems that everybody in the society plays digital games except for powerful people in the culture sphere. They're still worried. Everybody else is doing it, including your grandmother. And I wonder if the reverse is true. Is it also so that people with a lot of power in the scientific sphere are not big consumers of the fine arts, for instance, or culture in general?
That's sort of your C.P. Snow, the two cultures problem, right? That science and the arts don't talk to each other. My experience has been that top scientists and people who are very capable physicists tend also to be interested in the arts. They like music, they like art, that sort of thing. They tend not necessarily to be early adopters of technology, frequently because they're so preoccupied with what they're doing scientifically that they don't really pay that much attention to, Angry Birds doesn't penetrate physics a whole lot.
So then they're more like artists in that sense. I see.
I think so.
Hey, sometimes when new research projects are presented or even new gadgets come out, often people will say, wow, this is like science fiction. Does that ever happen to you guys? Sabine is laughing.
On the gadget level, it does happen indeed. I was thinking of this recently on the news, the battery charger for this hybrid car that is without cord nowadays. And I was wondering, okay, will we have cordless energy transmission in the future? I wonder how this will work. It works for batteries. When will be the cordless power supply? When will we have it? I don't know how to solve this problem physically. Yeah. But it will simplify our lives, I guess. So some aspects sometimes come up on the news, and I think, wow.
What about Chad? Do you think, wow, this is science fiction about our time?
Oh, definitely. Just this week, right? The story of we found water on Mars, right? That's a real living in the future moment right there.
Yeah.
I tend to want to think of myself as not being a technophile, but then this morning I looked at my watch and I found out that it is water resistant down to 100 meters. And then I thought, whenever will I go down 100 meters in the water? So,
and this technology on your arm is probably like 70 years old, and you're shocked.
Yes, probably, yes. Yeah.
What about Sara? Are you astounded at living in the future?
I'm waiting for the self-cleaning home.
It's been promised for so long. It's sort of the jetpack moment. Where's my jetpack question of the real world? Where's my self-cleaning home? Yeah. But do you think that generally that the way science and innovation are portrayed in popular culture affect consumers' relationship to technologies and to these kinds of changes?
Definitely, yeah.
Yes, in general.
Yes.
In general.
So there's still, and of course, I mean, we can't ask artists to take a lot of responsibility for that, but there's some interesting area there that seems to be covered by neither side. Sara, I realized I've almost forgotten to bring up something super important. You've said when we discuss innovation, we tend to discuss technology, but social innovation, behavioral innovation are equally important to discuss. What do you mean by this?
Well, for example, in a sustainable future, even if we need technical development and it will help us a long way, we also need to change the way we are living. And we need to really to think deeply about this. How are we living? How we are traveling? How we're spending our vacation? How our life is going to be? Because technology is not being able to save us, even if we would like that to happen. It's not going to happen because there's too much to need to be changed. And even if technology will help us a long way, we have to be willing to take on the technological changes that they are providing. So we also need social innovation and behavioral innovation.
And the question is how that is done. Whose job is it? Because we do research behaviors, but we don't teach designing behaviors. That sounds, unless you go to advertising school.
Exactly, and that's my point, that there's not really anybody doing that. Yeah. And so what today we are either innovating and development technically, or we are providing information for people on how they should shop or insulate their homes, or etc. But there's very few that are actually designing or innovating socially.
I realize we only have a few minutes left of the program. Do we have an audience question? Yes, please go to the stand and state your name and affiliation. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Fredrika Hellgren. I'm a medical student at Karolinska Institutet. And my question is, because we talked about how art and books can influence the future, do you think then that people who write science fiction, for instance, have sort of an ethical responsibility in what they create?
That's a very good question. Thank you, Fredrika. Joakim.
Yes, I think that the writers themselves would definitely think that they have that kind of responsibility. And I could take Margaret Atwood as an example. She has really worked consistently with issues in her fiction that she think are questions that need to be addressed by the whole of humanity. She wouldn't call her own fiction science fiction because she says it's speculative fiction, because everything that she writes about could actually happen. So that's her stance on that. Yeah.
I think I don't remember the specific person to attribute this to, but there's a well-known line within the science fiction genre saying that while science fiction appears to be about the future, the books and stories are always really about concerns of the moment. So, you look at Star Trek, it's set far in the future, but they have episodes about, there's that half black, half white aliens that, it's really about civil rights. You look at a lot of the fiction being today, it's set way in the future, but it's really about environmental concerns that are affecting us now, or social justice issues that are affecting us now. And so there's a sense in which science fiction is always about now and addressing ethical issues of the present, regardless of set.
I'm going to finish the show by asking you a question that I actually asked in the intro about what some of the new leaps that we could imagine from the popular culture today. So perhaps you could all mention briefly a piece of fiction that you've read or watched that has given you an interesting thought or a novel idea or something like that. Let's do a quick round at the end. Chad, what story has given you an idea recently?
The two things I've read most recently have been Neil Stephenson's Seven Eves, where the moon blows up at the start of the story and he plays that through, it's a really interesting. And in a similar sort of vein, The Martian, which is a movie that's about to come out this week, which I think is terrific.
premiering on Friday.
What about Sara?
Well, I just saw this Pixar movie, Inside Out, recently with my 6-year-old niece, and I really like that. It's about how feelings work in our heads. So there are 5 basic feelings that and it gave me some really, I think it was great, and it visualized very complex psychological phenomena in a way that's available for everybody. Really.
Neuroscience for 6-year-olds. Joakim, briefly.
Yeah, sorry to bring in a dystopian novel here, but I came to think of Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, and what I learned from that is to be careful with gene manipulation.
And briefly, Sabine.
I read Kim Stanley Robinson's novel just recent, came out, Aurora, about interstellar arcs, or these intergenerational spaceships, fraught with problems, tell us a lot about problems with our metabolisms on Earth, systems ecology, population ecology, and I'd like to take that up also in my own work.
Thank you. That's wonderful. That's all we had time for this evening. Thank you, Sara Ilstedt, Joakim Wrethed, Sabine Höhler, and Chad Orzel. Crosstalks will be back next month with a new exciting topic. Until then, as always, be safe and be brave.